The dust hung thick in the air as Jacob Miller guided his hover truck across the red plains of Kepler 442b, and he had been ranching on this frontier world for nearly 8 years, now raising modified cattle that could breathe the thin atmosphere. And the work was hard and the isolation brutal, but it was honest living far from Earth's overcrowded cities, and he was checking the northern fence line when he spotted something unusual near the canyon ridge, and at first he thought it was a boulder, but as he drew closer, his weathered eyes caught movement, and Jacob brought the truck to a halt and grabbed his rifle out of habit, though he lowered it immediately when he saw what lay before him. A native Keplerian collapsed against the rocks, and their blue-gray skin slicked with something dark that Jacob recognized as blood. And the being's 6 limbs were folded awkwardly, and their chest plates rose and fell in shallow, desperate breaths, and they wore what appeared to be ceremonial leather, adorned with carved bone talismans now torn and bloodied. And Jacob had seen Keplerians from a distance before, and the indigenous species that roamed the deeper territories beyond human settlement. And the colonial charter strictly forbade interaction, and the government wanted no conflicts and no complications. But as Jacob stared at the dying being before him, he knew he couldn't just walk away. He approached slowly with hands visible and speaking in a low, calm voice, even though he knew the native couldn't understand English. And the Keplerian's large dark eyes fixed on him, and pupils contracting in what might have been fear or pain, and Jacob could see the wound now in a savage gash across their side, possibly from one of the rock leopards that prowled the canyons. And he knelt beside the native and said, "Easy there, and I'm not going to hurt you." And the Keplerian made a clicking sound in their translator organs vibrating in their throat, and they tried to pull away, but they were too weak. Jacob quickly retrieved his medical kit from the truck, and it was designed for human injuries. But he had picked up enough veterinary knowledge from his cattle to understand basic wound treatment, and he worked quickly and cleaning the wound with antiseptic and applying synthetic skin patches. And the Keplerian watched him with those unblinking eyes and their breathing gradually steadying. And Jacob offered water from his canteen, not knowing if they could even drink it. But the natives' mouthparts opened and they drank gratefully. As the sun began to set and painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, Jacob made a decision, and he couldn't leave the injured native out here overnight, and the temperature would drop below freezing, and the predators would be hunting, and carefully he lifted the surprisingly light being and carried them to his truck and laying them gently in the cargo bed on a bed of emergency blankets. And the drive back to his ranch took an hour, and Jacob's mind raced with the implications of what he was doing, and he could lose his colonial license and face deportation back to Earth or worse. But when he glanced in the mirror at the wounded native wrapped in his blankets, he knew he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. His ranch house was modest and a prefabricated structure with solar panels and a water recycler, and he carried the Keplerian inside and laid them on his couch and the only piece of real furniture he owned. And throughout the night, Jacob tended to his unexpected guest and changing bandages and offering food that went untouched. And by morning the natives' eyes had regained some of their brightness, and they sat up slowly and clicking and humming in their strange language and gesturing at their bandaged wound and then at Jacob, and it seemed like gratitude, but Jacob couldn't be sure. The Keplerians stood and testing their limbs and moved toward the door, and Jacob didn't try to stop them. And he watched as the native paused at the threshold and turned back and touched their chest with one hand in what was clearly a gesture of respect. And then they were gone and disappearing into the morning mist that rolled across the plains, and Jacob sighed and poured himself coffee, and wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or simply done what any decent person would do, and he had no idea that his answer would come sooner than he imagined. Jacob spent the rest of the morning trying to return to his normal routine, but normalcy felt impossible after the previous day's events, and he fed his cattle and checked the water systems and repaired a section of fence that the wind had damaged, and all the while his mind kept returning to the wounded Keplerian, and the look in their eyes when they left, and around midday his comm unit chirped, and it was Charlie Brooks and his nearest neighbor living 40 miles to the east, and Charlie's voice crackled with static and something else and something that might have been fear. Charlie asked if Jacob was seeing this and to check his perimeter cameras because the wildlife sensors were going crazy over at his place. And Jacob pulled up his security system on his datapad, and his ranch was surrounded by motion sensors designed to alert him to cattle breaches or predator threats, and every single one of them was flashing red, and his stomach dropped as he switched to the camera feeds, and figures moved through the scrubland surrounding his property, and dozens of them, and no more than that. And they moved with purpose and not the random wandering of animals, and Jacob zoomed in on one camera feed and his breath caught in his throat. Keplerians and hundreds of them, and all converging on his ranch, and Jacob told Charlie he would have to call him back, and his voice strangely calm, despite the adrenaline flooding his system, and Charlie asked what was going on, but Jacob had already ended the call, and he grabbed his rifle from the rack by the door and then hesitated, and what good would one gun do against an army? And these natives hadn't attacked yet, and they were simply surrounding him and moving into position with military precision. He thought about calling the colonial authorities, but what would he tell them? And that he had violated the charter by helping a native, and now their entire tribe was at his doorstep, and he would be arrested before the cavalry arrived, and assuming they even came at all. And out here on the frontier, colonists were expected to solve their own problems, and Jacob made a decision, and he left the rifle by the door and sealed on its rack and walked outside with his hands empty and visible, and the sight that greeted him stole the breath from his lungs, and they stretched across the landscape like a living carpet, and 300 warriors at least, and maybe more. They rode on six-legged creatures that resembled a cross between horses and insects, and chitinous armor glinting in the afternoon sun, and the Keplerians themselves wore battle dress, and their bodies painted with geometric patterns, and carried weapons ranging from traditional spears to what looked disturbingly like energy rifles scavenged or traded from off-world sources, and the circle of warriors had stopped about 100 yards from his ranch house, and a perfect ring of potential violence, and they simply waited and mounted and silent, and their dark eyes fixed on his small homestead. Jacob's mouth went dry, and this was it, and he had saved one of them, and somehow that single act of mercy had triggered something he couldn't understand, and a cultural violation or a territorial dispute, and he had no way of knowing, and he stood on his porch and acutely aware of how small and vulnerable he was, and one man and one ranch against an army, and if they wanted him dead, he would die, and it was that simple, but they didn't attack, and they just watched. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the sun climbed higher and beating down on the red plains, and Jacob remained on his porch, and unwilling to retreat inside, and unwilling to show fear, and the Keplerians remained in their circle and motionless as statues, and then movement at the edge of the perimeter, and the circle parted and a group of riders approached, and Jacob recognized the lead figure immediately, despite the ceremonial headdress they now wore, and it was the native he had saved, and looking far healthier than they had any right to be, and behind them rode what Jacob assumed were tribal leaders, and their armor more elaborate, and their bearing radiating authority. The group stopped 20 feet from his porch, and the native he had saved dismounted and walked forward alone, and they moved with confidence now, and no trace of yesterday's injury visible in their gait, and when they reached the base of Jacob's porch steps they knelt and pressing their forehead to the dust, and Jacob had no idea what that meant, but it didn't feel threatening, and the native rose and began to speak, and their clicking language accompanied by elaborate gestures, and Jacob shook his head helplessly and said, "I don't understand, and I'm sorry, and I don't speak your language." The native paused and then reached into a pouch at their side, and they produced a small device, and clearly of human manufacture, and probably something traded or salvaged from a crashed ship, and after a moment of manipulation a synthesized voice emerged in speaking accented but comprehensible English, and it said, "You saved Kale, and you showed mercy when your kind shows only territory hunger, and you bound wounds when you could have taken honor prize, and this is not forgotten." And Jacob blinked and said, "I just did what anyone should do, and you were hurt, and I couldn't leave you to die." The native and Kale tilted their head in a gesture that might have been surprise, and they spoke again, and the translator rendered their words and said, "Your kind does leave us to die, and your kind takes land, and gives nothing, but you are different, and you give kindness, and this changes the path." And one of the elder Keplerians rode forward and dismounted, and their translator was more sophisticated, and their English clearer, and they said, "I am Elder Ven, and we came prepared for battle, and we came to drive you from this land as we have driven others, but Kale speaks of mercy, and Kale speaks of honor, and we must see this ourselves." Jacob felt his heart hammering and said, "I don't want a war, and I just want to ranch my land in peace." And Ven repeated the word peace as if testing it, and said, "This is not a thing your colonies offer, and they take, and they push us into the dustlands where nothing grows, And Jacob said quietly, "That I'm not the colonies and I'm just one man trying to make a life." And Ven studied him for a long moment and said, "You saved the child of our war leader and the child of Kale Mother, who rides with us now, and she called for your death and for vengeance for all your kind has taken, but Kyle spoke against this, and Kyle said, 'You showed the old ways and the ways before the Sky People came, and honor for honor and life for life.'" Jacob glanced at Kale, and seeing them in a new light and not just a wounded native but someone's child and someone important, and he said, "I didn't know, but it wouldn't have mattered and they needed help." And Ven's expression was unreadable, but they gestured to the assembled warriors and said, "We came for war. But Kale asks for peace and one chance and one test. And if you are true, and if you show the old ways, perhaps there is a path forward, and perhaps not all Sky People are oath-breakers." And Jacob asked warily what kind of test, and Ven said, "Time will show. And we watch now and we wait. And if you prove true as Kale believes, there may be peace between your home and our clan. And if not," and the elder left the threat unspoken. With that, Ven remounted their creature, and Kale bowed to Jacob once more, and then returned to the group, and the entire assembly wheeled as one, and began to withdraw, and not scattering but maintaining their formation as they retreated into the hills. And Jacob watched them go, and his legs suddenly weak, and he sat down hard on his porch steps, and his hands shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. And he had been judged and somehow found not wanting, but the test, whatever it was, had only just begun. The warriors didn't leave, and Jacob discovered this the next morning when he checked his perimeter cameras and found Keplerian sentries posted at intervals around his property line, and they made no attempt to hide their presence in standing or sitting in plain view, and their dark eyes always turned toward his ranch. And he went about his work with an audience for the first time in 8 years, and it was deeply unsettling to repair a fence post while knowing that a warrior with a spear sat on a ridge 300 yards away watching his every move. Yet they never approached and never interfered and never threatened, and they simply observed. Charlie called again that afternoon, and his voice tight with anxiety, and said, "The colonial administrator is asking questions, and apparently someone reported unusual native activity in their sector, and they're talking about sending a military survey team." And Jacob cursed under his breath and told Charlie to tell them it's nothing and just a migration pattern or something. And Charlie said a migration pattern and asked, "What the hell is going on?" And the rumors say there's an army camped around his place, and Jacob said not an army, though the distinction felt thin. "And it's complicated, Charlie, but I need you to keep the authorities out of this for as long as you can. And if the military shows up, this whole thing could go sideways." Charlie asked what Jacob did, and Jacob said simply that I helped someone and now I'm dealing with the consequences. "And please, Charlie, and just buy me some time." And after a long pause, Charlie sighed and said, 1 week. And that's all I can give you. And after that, if there's still an army on your doorstep, I'll have to report it officially, and the safety of the entire sector could be at stake." And Jacob agreed to 1 week and thanked him. As the days passed, Jacob fell into a strange routine, and he tended his cattle and maintained his equipment and lived his life while being constantly watched. And sometimes he would catch glimpses of Kale among the sentries, and recognizable by the way they moved. And once he raised a hand in greeting, and after a moment Kale raised one back, and on the 4th day something changed, and Jacob was working on his water recycler and a temperamental piece of machinery that required constant maintenance when he heard a commotion from his cattle pen, and he grabbed a shock prod and ran, and fearing that one of the animals had gotten sick or injured. What he found instead was a Keplerian warrior inside his fence and kneeling beside one of his cows, and the animal was in clear distress and lying on its side and breathing heavily, and Jacob recognized the signs immediately, and a difficult calving, and the mother needed help or both she and the calf would die. And the warrior looked up as Jacob approached, and for a moment they locked eyes, and the Keplerian slowly stood and backed away with hands visible, and speaking in their clicking language. And though Jacob couldn't understand the words, the intent was clear, and I was trying to help. Jacob nodded and moved to the cow and running his hands over her swollen belly. And he had done this before, but never with an alien warrior watching his every move. And he rolled up his sleeves and got to work, and reaching inside to reposition the calf, and it was delicate and dangerous work, and one wrong move could kill both animals. And the warrior clicked something, and suddenly they were beside Jacob, and their multiple hands moving with surprising gentleness as they helped support the cow's weight And Jacob glanced at them in surprise, but there was no time for questions, and together they worked in silent coordination, and human and Keplerian united in the simple goal of saving a life. 20 minutes later, a wet and confused calf lay in the straw and already struggling to stand, and the mother lowed softly and exhausted but alive, and Jacob sat back on his heels, and covered in birth fluids and sweat, and couldn't help but laugh, with relief. And the warrior clicked something that might have been laughter too, and then did something unexpected, and they reached into a pouch, and pulled out a water skin, and offering it to Jacob. And he took it gratefully, and drank. And the liquid, sweet and slightly spiced and definitely not water but refreshing nonetheless, and Jacob said thank you. And the warrior inclined their head in a gesture that transcended species. By that evening, word had apparently spread, and when Jacob looked at his perimeter cameras he saw that the sentries had moved closer, and now visible from his windows, and they no longer felt like a threat, and more like guardians, and he couldn't quite put his finger on when the shift had occurred, and Cale appeared at his door the next morning, and this time approaching openly and knocking on the frame, and Jacob invited them in, and they spent an hour attempting to communicate through the translator device, and the conversation was halting and sometimes confusing, but Jacob learned that the warrior who helped with the calf was named Dren, and that the action had been noted by the clan. Cale explained through the device that you show same spirit with animal kin as with people kin, and this is seen, and this is measured. And Jacob admitted that I don't understand what I'm being tested for, and Cale's expression was difficult to read, but their tone even filtered through the translator was thoughtful, and they said you're kind. They take but do not give, and they see land as empty, because we do not build as you build, and they see us as animals, because we do not speak as you speak. But you see life as life, and water as water, and pain as pain, and this is the old way. And the way before the forgetting. Jacob asked, are all the colonies like that? And are we really that bad? And Cale admitted not all but enough, and enough that Elder Ven and the War Mothers called for your kind to be pushed back into the sky. But now you save Cale, and now Dren reports that you honor the animal kin. And now we must think carefully, and war is easy and peace is hard, and we must know if you are worth the hard path. And Jacob nodded slowly, and beginning to understand. And he wasn't just being tested as an individual, and he was being evaluated as a possible bridge between two species that had been sliding toward war, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. He said honestly that I don't know if I can be what you need me to be, and I'm just a rancher, and Cale said perhaps that is enough. And Charlie's deadline was approaching fast, and Jacob knew that once the colonial authorities got involved, any chance of peaceful resolution would evaporate, and the military would see the Keplerian presence as a threat, and the natives would see the military response as aggression, and everything would spiral into the very conflict both sides seemed to be trying to avoid. He was pondering this problem while repairing his solar panel array, when a delegation arrived, and this time it wasn't just Cale and Elder Ven, but a larger group including several individuals whose elaborate dress suggested high status, and they approached slowly and openly, and giving Jacob time to see them coming. And he climbed down from the roof and waited by his porch, and his heart raced, but he kept his hands visible, and his posture relaxed, and Elder Ven spoke first, and their translator, rendering the words with formal gravity. Ven said, Jacob Miller, and you have been watched, and you have been measured, and the clan mothers have debated long into the dark hours, and you have shown the virtues we thought were dead among sky people, and mercy and kindness and honor toward all living things, but virtues alone do not solve the problems between our peoples. And Jacob nodded, and sensing this was a moment to listen rather than speak, and one of the other elders and a scarred warrior whose translator identified them as War Mother Shen stepped forward. Shen said, your colonies grow like fever bloom across the Red Plains, and each year they push further into the sacred territories and the breeding grounds and the ancient sites, and we are forced into lands where nothing grows, and where our herds starve, and where our children cry from hunger. And this cannot continue, and soon there will be no choice but war. And the bluntness of the statement hit Jacob like a punch, and he asked, is that what this is about? And territory negotiations? And Ven said more than territory, and it is about whether two peoples can share one world, or whether one must destroy the other to survive. And your government does not see us as people, and they see us as obstacles and animals, to be managed or eliminated, and they do not negotiate with animals. Jacob felt anger rising in his chest, and not at the Keplerians, but at the truth of their words. And he had seen the colonial reports and read the administrative briefings, and the Keplerians were always listed under wildlife management rather than indigenous relations, and it was a bureaucratic distinction that revealed everything about Earth's attitude toward the native population. And he asked, "So what do you want from me? And I'm nobody important, and I can't change colonial policy." And Ven said, "Perhaps not alone, but you have shown us something we needed to see, and that not all sky people are the same, and that some among you remember honor. And this gives us an idea, and a dangerous idea, but one that might spare both our peoples much blood." Cale stepped forward and, speaking directly to Jacob through their translator, and said, "We propose an alliance, and between this clan and you, Jacob Miller, and you allow us access to the water sources on your land and the springs in the northern canyons that our herds have used for generations, and in return we offer protection and trade goods and knowledge of the land that your kind does not possess." And Jacob's mind reeled, and he said an alliance, and that would be a direct violation of the colonial charter, and the non-interference clause explicitly forbids formal agreements with native populations without government approval. War Mother Shen said flatly, "Then seek approval and go to your leaders and tell them that one clan offers peace and cooperation, or tell them that all clans will soon offer war, and let them choose." And Jacob said they'll never approve it, though. Even as he spoke, he wasn't entirely sure. And the bureaucrats in the colonial office will see it as a precedent, and if one rancher can make agreements with the natives, others will too, and they'll lose control of the expansion plans. And Ven said, "Simply then they choose war." Jacob paced his porch, and his mind working through the implications, and if he agreed, and went to the colonial authorities, he would be admitting to breaking the charter by helping Cale, and at minimum he would lose his ranch, and at worst he could face imprisonment or deportation. But if he refused, the tentative peace that had developed over the past week would shatter, and when the fighting started, it would consume the entire sector. And he said slowly, "There's another option. And what if we don't ask for permission, and what if we just do it and you use the water sources and I don't report your presence, and we establish a working relationship quietly? And if it works, and if we can prove that cooperation is possible, maybe that evidence will be enough to change minds later." War Mother Shen said this is deception, though her tone was more curious than accusatory, and Jacob countered, "It's pragmatism. And look, the colonial government responds to two things, and profits and problems. And if I can show them that cooperation with your clan increases productivity and reduces conflict and benefits both species, they'll be more likely to accept it as a fait accompli than to approve it hypothetically." And Ven and Shen exchanged a long look, and some unspoken communication passing between them. Ven finally said, "This is a risk, and if discovered before proof is established, both you and we will face punishment, and your kind will declare you an outlaw, and our kind will say we were foolish to trust a sky person." And Jacob said, "I know, but I think it's a risk worth taking. And the alternative is war, and war is a certainty that everyone loses, and this way at least we have a chance." And Cale moved to stand beside Ven, and speaking rapidly in their native tongue, and the elder listened, and then nodded slowly. Ven said, "Cale reminds us that you have already taken risks for peace, and that you saved one life without thought of reward, and perhaps you will save many lives the same way." And Ven extended one of their hands toward Jacob, and said, "We accept this alliance, Jacob Miller, and we drink from the same spring, and we share the burden of peace." And Jacob took the offered hand, and feeling the strange texture of Keplerian skin against his palm, and the handclasp felt momentous, as if he were standing at a crossroads of history, and perhaps he was. Jacob said, "There's one more thing, and Charlie Brooks, my neighbor, has already noticed your presence, and I've bought time. But the colonial authorities will hear about this within days, and when they do, they'll send investigators, and we need a plan for what happens when they show up." And War Mother Shen said, "Let them come, and let them see that we stand with you, not against you, and let them wonder why the hostile natives have not killed the isolated rancher. And sometimes questions are more powerful than answers." And Jacob couldn't help but smile and said, "I think we might actually pull this off." Ven said, "Hope is good, but hope must be fed with action and come." We will show you the proper paths to the water sources and the signs to know when the herds are coming, and if we are to be allies, you must learn our ways as we learn yours. And as the sun set over the Red Plains, Jacob Miller found himself walking into the wilderness with 300 Keplerian warriors, and no longer a prisoner or a curiosity, but something unprecedented and a partner in peace. The next 3 weeks transformed everything Jacob thought he knew about Kepler 442b and its native inhabitants, and every morning members of the clan would arrive at his ranch, and sometimes just a few scouts and other times larger groups with children and elders, and they taught him to read the subtle signs in the landscape and the way the red dust swirled before a storm, and the plants that indicated underground water, and the tracks of predators and prey that he had been obliviously walking past for 8 years. In return, Jacob shared his knowledge, and he showed them how his water recycler worked, and the principles of solar energy collection, and the techniques he used to modify earth cattle for the alien environment, and the Keplerians proved to be quick learners, and their multiple hands giving them an advantage in complex mechanical tasks, and Dren, the warrior who had helped with the difficult calving, became a regular presence at the ranch, and they had a natural affinity for the cattle, and began helping Jacob with the daily care of the herd. Through Dren's translator, Jacob learned that the Keplerians had their own traditions of animal husbandry and herding massive six-legged creatures called throm across the plains in seasonal migrations, and Dren suggested one day that perhaps your cattle and our throm could graze together, and the throm eat the high grasses that your cattle cannot reach, and your cattle eat the low grasses that the throm trample, and together the land would support more life. And it was a simple idea, but it revealed something profound, and the possibility of true integration rather than competition. Jacob immediately saw the practical benefits, and his cattle were limited by the carrying capacity of his land. But if the Keplerians' herds could share the space in a complementary way, both populations could thrive, and he asked, "When is your next migration?" And Dren replied, "In 2 moons when the water stars rise," and pointing to a constellation that Jacob's astronomical charts identified as being visible in late autumn, and the clan moves to the northern ranges where the winter grasses grow. And Jacob said, concerned, that passes right through colonial territory and the expansion zones in Sector 7. Dren said quietly, "Yes, and each year the passage grows more dangerous, and each year there are more fences and more settlements and more sky people who shoot first and ask never. And 3 seasons ago we lost 12 throm and 2 herders to colonial militias who said we were trespassing on claimed land that has been ours for generations beyond counting." And the injustice of it burned in Jacob's chest. And he had been so focused on carving out his own piece of this world that he had never considered whose roots he might be blocking and whose ancient patterns he might be disrupting. Jacob proposed, "What if we could establish a corridor and a recognized path through the colonial settlements that your herds could use safely? And I have some contacts and other ranchers who might be sympathetic if approached the right way." And Dren's eyes brightened with interest, but their tone remained cautious, and said, "Your kind does not respect our paths, and why would this change?" And Jacob said, "Because now you have an advocate who speaks their language and understands their concerns. And let me try, and the worst that happens is they say no, and you're no worse off than before." That evening, Jacob sent carefully worded messages to every rancher he knew in the sector, and he didn't mention the Keplerians directly, and instead framing it as a proposal for coordinated herd management that would benefit everyone, and several ranchers responded with interest, and particularly those struggling with overgrazing problems on their own lands, and Charlie was the first to video call, and his weathered face filling Jacob's screen with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Charlie said, "All right, Jacob, and what's really going on? And I've been hearing stories and seeing things, and is it true you're working with the natives?" And Jacob took a breath and made a decision, and Charlie had been his friend for 6 years and had helped him through 2 harsh winters and a drought. And if he couldn't trust Charlie, this whole plan was doomed anyway. And he said simply, "Yes, I am. And Charlie, it's not what you think, and they're not savages or animals, and they're people, and complex people with their own culture and knowledge, and I've learned more about surviving on this planet in 3 weeks with them than I did in 8 years alone." Charlie was quiet for a long moment and said, "The colonial charter," and Jacob interrupted and said, "is wrong. And it's based on ignorance and fear, and these people were here first, and we've been treating them like obstacles instead of neighbors, and I'm trying to change that one relationship at a time." And Charlie said, "That's a hell of a risk you're taking." And Jacob said, "I know, but..." Charlie, I've seen what's coming if we don't change course, and the Keplerians are being pushed to the breaking point, and sooner or later they're going to push back, and when that happens, everyone in this sector will suffer. Or we can try something different, and we can try cooperation. Charlie rubbed his face and looking older than his 50 years and said, "Send me your proposal and the detailed one, not the sanitized version, and I want to know exactly what I'd be signing up for." And Jacob asked, "You're considering it?" And Charlie corrected, "I'm considering listening, and that's all I'm promising right now. But Jacob, if this goes wrong and if the authorities find out and it turns into a scandal, it's not just your ranch on the line, and it's all of us." And Jacob said solemnly, "I know, and I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe it was necessary, and this is bigger than individual ranches or even our sector. And this is about whether humanity can learn to share worlds instead of conquering them." After the call ended, Jacob stood on his porch and looked out at the night sky, and in the distance he could see the glow of Keplerian campfires on the hills, and a sight that would have terrified him a month ago, but now felt almost comforting. And Kale was out there somewhere, and Dren and Elder Ven and 300 warriors who had chosen to wait and to watch and to hope instead of going to war, and the weight of their trust was both inspiring and terrifying. The next morning brought unexpected news, and 5 ranchers, including Charlie, had agreed to a meeting, and they wanted to discuss the proposal in person and to see Jacob's ranch, and he suspected to see the Keplerians for themselves, and it was more than Jacob had dared to hope for. But it also meant the moment of truth was arriving faster than he was ready for, and he found Kale tending to one of the cattle and scratching the animal behind its ears with a gentle touch that seemed at odds with their warrior status. Jacob said, "We need to talk, and some of my neighbors are coming here in 3 days, and they want to learn about our arrangement and maybe join in, but they're scared. And they've probably heard all the colonial propaganda about your people being dangerous." And Kale listened through their translator and then clicked thoughtfully and said, "You want us to perform and to prove we are not monsters, and this is humiliating." And Jacob said, "I know, and I'm sorry, but Kale, this could be the beginning of something bigger. And if we can get 5 ranches working with your clan, then 10, then 20. Eventually, the colonial government will have to recognize the reality on the ground, and they'll have to change the charter, because the alternative would be admitting that dozens of their own colonists are criminals." Cal mused, "A revolution of small steps and interesting, and among my people change comes through grand gestures and great battles and moments of singular honor. But perhaps your way has merit too." And Jacob asked, "Will your elders agree to meet with my neighbors?" And Kael promised, "I will speak to them. But Jacob, understand this, and we are trusting you in a way we have never trusted Sky people before. And if this betrayal, and if your neighbors come with weapons and soldiers behind them, the war that follows will be unlike anything your kind has faced on this world." Jacob said, "I understand, though." The words felt inadequate to the gravity of the moment, and I'm trusting them too. And I'm trusting that fear can be overcome with understanding, and that greed can be tempered with wisdom. And maybe I'm naive, but I have to believe it's possible." And Kale placed one of their hands on Jacob's shoulder, and a gesture they had learned from watching him, and said, "Not naive and hopeful, and hope is its own kind of courage." The 3 days before the meeting passed in a blur of preparation, and Jacob cleaned his ranch house thoroughly, and prepared food and drinks, and rehearsed arguments in his head, until he was sure he sounded insane, and the Keplerians, for their part, withdrew to their camps in the hills, and visible but not intrusive, and a compromise between hiding and overwhelming their guests. And when the appointed day arrived, Jacob was up before dawn, and checking and rechecking everything. At mid-morning, the first hover truck appeared on the horizon, and Charlie's vehicle reassuringly familiar, and then another and another, until 5 trucks were parked in an arc around Jacob's ranch house, and the ranchers who emerged were a diverse group, and Charlie, of course, with his salt and pepper beard and cautious eyes, and Helen Porter, a tough woman in her 60s, who ran the largest cattle operation in the sector, and Luis Martinez, young and idealistic and barely 30 and still paying off his colonial settlement loan, and Karen Swift, a biologist turned rancher, who had always been more interested in the planet's ecosystem than profits. And finally, Wayne Douglas, a hard-bitten man in his 50s, with a reputation for being aggressively territorial. Jacob had expected Charlie and maybe Helen, but Wayne's presence was a surprise and not necessarily a welcome one, and Jacob said, "Thanks for coming, and I know this is unusual, And Wayne interrupted and said unusual and try illegal and try insane. And I came here to see for myself if the rumors were true and if you'd actually gone native and lost your mind. And Charlie said warningly, Wayne, but Jacob said no, let him talk. And Wayne, what do you think happens in 5 years and 10 years as more colonists arrive and we keep pushing the Keplerians further into the margins, and do you think they'll just accept extinction quietly? Wayne shot back. I think they should recognize that humanity is the dominant species on this planet now, and we have the technology and the firepower and the colonial charter, and this is our world now. And Karen Swift spoke up, and her voice calm, but firm, and said, is it? And we've been here less than a decade, and they've been here for thousands of years and maybe longer. And we don't even know the full extent of their civilization because we've never bothered to ask, and we've just assumed that because they don't build cities like ours, they must be primitives. And Wayne said this is exactly the kind of academic nonsense that gets people killed. Helen Porter's voice cut through the argument like a knife, and she said enough and fixed her hard gaze on Jacob and said, we didn't drive 2 hours to debate philosophy, and you said you had something to show us and some new approach that would benefit all of us and show us or we're leaving. And Jacob nodded and pulled out his datapad and projecting a holographic map of the sector. And he explained, the red zones are current ranch holdings and the blue zones are areas the Keplerians use for their herds' seasonal migrations, and notice how they're increasingly overlapping. And that's what's driving the conflict. But look at this. He manipulated the map and adding new layers of data and said the Keplerian herds primarily eat tall grasses and shrubs that grow in rocky terrain, and our cattle eat low grasses in flatlands. And there's actually minimal competition for resources, but only if we coordinate. And Luis Martinez leaned forward and studying the map with interest and said, you're proposing integrated herding and sharing grazing lands. And Jacob said more than that, and the Keplerians have intimate knowledge of this, planet's ecosystems and things that would take us centuries to learn through trial and error. And they know which plants are toxic and which ones indicate underground water, and where predators den, and when storms are coming. And that knowledge could increase our productivity while decreasing losses. Helen asked sharply, in exchange for what, and what do they want? And a new voice said respect, and everyone turned to see Elder Ven approaching and accompanied by Kyle and 2 other Keplerians, and the ranchers instinctively tensed and hands moving toward weapons that Jacob desperately hoped they had left in their vehicles. And Jacob said quickly, it's okay. And this is Elder Ven, their clan leader, and you've heard me mention Kale. Ven's translator rendered their words in careful English and said, we want passage rights through traditional migration routes, and we want access to water sources that have been ours since time before memory, and we want to be seen as people, not pests to be exterminated, and these are not large demands. And Wayne said flatly, they're impossible demands, and those migration routes go through claimed territory, and colonial law is clear and surveyed. Land belongs to the humans who file claims, and you can't just wander through people's property because you did it 1,000 years ago. Ven repeated cannot, and an interesting word, and it means will not, yes, and it means we refuse to honor what came before, and we refuse to see that our laws may be unjust. And Wayne started to say, now, hold on. But Helen interrupted, and surprising everyone, and said, let them speak. And she was looking at Ven with an intensity that Jacob recognized as her evaluating gaze, and the same look she got when assessing cattle or equipment for purchase. Ven continued and said, Jacob Miller showed us that not all sky people are oath breakers, and he saved Kale when he could have left them to die, and he tends his animals with care and treats the land with respect. And he is proof that cooperation is possible, and we offer this cooperation to you as well, if you are brave enough to accept it. And Wayne scoffed, brave? And you mean foolish enough to violate colonial law? And Ven said, I mean brave enough to do what is right, rather than what is legal, and surely your kind understands that laws can be wrong, and you have your own history of unjust rules that were later changed. That statement hung in the air and uncomfortable in its accuracy. And Karen Swift spoke up and asked what exactly would this cooperation look like in practice, and over the next 2 hours they hammered out details. And Kale proved to be an excellent negotiator and explaining the Keplerian perspective with clarity, while showing genuine interest in understanding the humans' concerns. And Dren arrived at one point and demonstrated their skill with Jacob's cattle, which impressed even the skeptical Wayne. The turning point came when Helen asked to see Jacob's productivity records, and he pulled up his data from the past 3 weeks, and showing a 15% increase in cattle health markers, and a 20% reduction in water usage thanks to Keplerian guidance on optimal grazing patterns. And Helen said bluntly, that's real money and I'd be a fool to ignore numbers like that. And Wayne warned the colonial authorities won't see it that way, and they'll see collaboration with natives as a threat to human control of the planet. Charlie said, then we don't tell them, and not until we have to, and not until the benefits are too obvious to ignore. And Wayne said, that's conspiracy. And Charlie countered, that's pragmatism. And look, I'm not saying I'm fully on board with all this yet, but I'm saying that Jacob's shown us something worth considering. And if we can increase productivity while reducing conflict, isn't that worth exploring? And Luis Martinez nodded enthusiastically and said, I've been barely making my loan payments, and a 15% improvement could be the difference between success and bankruptcy. Helen said, I need time to think, and this is a major decision, but Elder Venn, I want to propose something and let one of your herders work with my operation for a month like Dren has been doing with Jacob, and if I see similar improvements, I'll consider a formal arrangement. And Venn consulted with the other Keplerians in their clicking language, and then nodded and said, this is acceptable, and we will send our best herder, and one who speaks some of your language, and if you prove trustworthy, as Jacob has, there will be peace between your home and our clan. Wayne remained unconvinced and arguing that they were all courting disaster, but he was outnumbered and eventually he agreed to at least keep quiet about what he had seen, even if he wouldn't participate himself. And as the sun began to set and the ranchers prepared to leave, Charlie pulled Jacob aside and said quietly, you did good today, and I'm still scared as hell about what happens when the authorities find out. But I'm proud of you for trying. And Jacob said, it's not over yet, and this was just the first step, and we need to make this work and prove it's viable before anyone outside the sector catches wind of it. Charlie said, then we'd better make it count. And after the last truck had departed, Cale approached Jacob with something that might have been a smile on their alien features, and said, your herd leaders are not what I expected, and some have wisdom, and some have fear, but most have both, and this is good, and only fools have no fear. And Jacob asked, do you think it will work and all of this? And Cale said thoughtfully, I think that the path we walk is narrow with cliffs on both sides, but we walk it together now, not alone, and that must count for something. Jacob looked out at the red plains, and now dotted with both human structures and Keplerian camps and two civilizations, learning to occupy the same space, and it was messy and complicated and fragile as glass, but it was also beautiful in its own way. And he said yes, and it counts for everything. Inspector Lane seemed at a loss for words, and she had clearly expected to find a rogue colonist breaking rules and causing problems, not an entire community united in defense of their cooperative arrangement. And Elder Venn stepped forward and, speaking with formal gravity through their translator, and said, Inspector Lane, and that is your title, yes, and you have authority among your people. And Lane replied, I represent the colonial administration. Yes, and Venn said, then hear me, and the Keplerian clans have watched your kind spread across our world for many seasons, and we have seen you take and giving nothing in return, and we have debated among ourselves whether to make war and to drive you back into the sky, and many have called for this, and many have sharpened their weapons and prepared for battle. The militia officers tensed and hands definitely on weapons now, and Jacob felt his heart hammering, and Venn continued. But then Jacob Miller showed us a different possibility, and not conquest and not submission, but partnership, and now others like him show us the same, and this is new and this is strange, but this is also good. And we offer you a choice, Inspector Lane, and return to your leaders and tell them that war is coming, or tell them that peace is possible, if they have the wisdom to accept it. And Lane asked, are you threatening the colonial government? And Venn said, I am offering it a gift, and the gift of time and time to learn and to adapt and to grow. But this gift is not infinite. And the clans gather, and the war mothers sharpen their anger, and if your laws prevent peace, then your laws will reap war, and this is simple truth. Inspector Lane was quiet for a long moment, and finally she turned to her junior administrator and said, note in the report that the situation is complex and requires further study, and recommend that enforcement action be suspended pending a comprehensive review of Indigenous Relations policy. And the young man looked confused and said, ma'am, and the charter violations are clear. And Lane snapped, I'm aware of what the charter says, and I'm also aware that my job is to promote the security and prosperity of colonial settlements, and arresting these people and provoking a war with the native population would accomplish neither goal. and we need time to think and to consult with experts and to perhaps reconsider our approach." She turned back to Jacob and the assembled crowd and said, "I'm not saying you're in the clear, Mr. Miller, but I'm also not shutting you down today, and you've got 30 days, and in that time I'll be filing recommendations with the Colonial Council, and they may agree with me that the charter needs updating, or they may send the military to enforce it, and either way, this situation is beyond my pay grade." And Jacob said thank you, and meaning it sincerely. And as the colonial vehicles departed, and leaving dust trails in their wake, Jacob felt the tension drain from his body. And it wasn't a victory, not yet, but it wasn't a defeat either. And they had bought time, and time was what they needed most. Cale placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You stood firm and your herd leaders stood firm, and this is how change begins, I think." And Wayne Douglas muttered, "This is how revolutions begin." But he was almost smiling. And the 30 days Inspector Lane had granted them passed in a blur of activity, and word had spread through the sector and then beyond, and other ranchers came to see the cooperative arrangements for themselves, and some skeptical and others intrigued. And the story had reached the colony's media networks and sparking fierce debate about the charter and indigenous rights and humanity's approach to colonization. Jacob found himself thrust into an unexpected role as spokesperson, and doing interviews and writing articles explaining their experiment, and he hated the attention, but endured it because he understood that public opinion might be their strongest. Defense Against Administrative Crackdown and Luis Martinez's Bridge Manual had evolved into a comprehensive guide that was being quietly circulated among colonists and Keplerians alike, and it covered everything from basic language lessons to ecological cooperation strategies and becoming an unofficial blueprint for human-Keplerian relations. The Keplerian clans, meanwhile, had not been idle, and Elder Venn had taken the unprecedented step of calling a gathering of clan leaders from across the continent, and for the first time in generations the scattered tribes came together to discuss a unified response to human colonization, and some advocated for war and for driving the humans back into the sky, and others, influenced by reports of the successful cooperation in Jacob's sector, argued for cautious engagement, and the debate raged among the Keplerians just as it raged among the humans. On the 28th day, Jacob received a comm from Inspector Lane, and she said, "Mr. Miller, I wanted to give you advance notice, and the Colonial Council has made its decision, and they're sending a delegation tomorrow to tour your operation and make a final determination on whether to pursue enforcement or policy revision." And Jacob asked, "What can you tell me about them?" And Lane said the head delegate is Council Member Richard Hayes, and he's conservative and by the book and not known for flexibility, but he's also pragmatic. And if you can show him concrete benefits to the colony as a whole, he might listen, and no promises. After the call ended, Jacob gathered his neighbors and the Keplerian leaders, and they had one day to prepare for the most important presentation of their lives. And Council Member Hayes arrived with a substantial entourage, including security and scientists and media personnel and various administrative officials, and he was a tall man in his 60s and gray-haired and stern, with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed, and Jacob had prepared his ranch carefully, and he arranged for Hayes to observe every aspect of the human-Keplerian cooperation, and the integrated herding and the shared water management, and the ecological monitoring and the cultural exchange programs Luis had developed. But the moment that seemed to resonate most came unexpectedly, and Hayes was observing Dren working with one of Jacob's cattle, and a young bull that had always been skittish and difficult, and Dren approached the animal with patience and confidence, and using a combination of touch and sound that calmed the bull immediately. And Hayes asked through a translator, "How did you learn that technique?" And Dren replied, "My grandmother taught me," and she learned from her grandmother and back through the generations to times before memory, and we have always known how to speak with the four legs because we share this world with them, not rule over them. Hayes watched in silence as Dren completed the examination, and then turned to Jacob and asked, "How long would it have taken you to accomplish what they just did?" And Jacob admitted hours and maybe longer, and that bull's been a problem for months. And Hayes nodded slowly and his expression thoughtful, and he continued the tour and asking pointed questions about productivity gains and resource usage and conflict incidents and long-term sustainability. And Jacob and the others answered honestly, and hiding nothing and knowing that their credibility depended on transparency. At the end of the day, Hayes requested a private meeting with just Jacob and Elder Venn and Inspector Lane, and Hayes began, I'm going to be frank with you, and what you've built here frightens the Colonial Council, and not because it's dangerous, but because it's unprecedented and we've spent decades developing protocols for human expansion based on keeping native populations at arm's length. And you're proposing we throw out that entire framework. And Jacob said we're proposing you replace a broken framework with one that actually works. Hayes conceded maybe. But change at this scale doesn't happen overnight, and the charter was written for good reasons. And other worlds have seen contact go horribly wrong. And Elder Venn interjected because contact was always framed as conquest. And your kind arrives and claims ownership, and treats indigenous peoples as obstacles. And this creates resentment, which creates conflict, which justifies your fears. And it is, how do you say, a self-fulfilling cycle. And Hayes corrected absently, a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then seemed to realize he was engaging in exactly the kind of dialogue the charter was designed to prevent. Inspector Lane spoke up and said, "Council member, if I may, and I've spent considerable time studying this situation, and the cooperation Mr. Miller and the others have developed isn't just beneficial for individual ranches, and it has implications for the entire colony's future. And as more settlers arrive, we'll face increasing conflict over resources unless we find a way to share this planet with its indigenous inhabitants. And these people have handed us a roadmap." And Hayes stood and walked to the window and looking out at the red plains where human and Keplerian workers moved together, and tending to combined herds in the fading light. He said, "Finally, I can't unilaterally change the charter, but I can recommend a pilot program. And we designate this sector as a test zone for cooperative indigenous relations. And for 2 years, we suspend certain charter provisions here and monitor the results, and if it works and if productivity increases and conflicts decrease, we use that data to argue for broader policy changes." And Jacob asked, "And if it doesn't work?" And Hayes said, "Then we enforce the charter strictly, and you'll likely lose your land rights for violations, but I'm betting it will work. And I've seen enough today to believe that. And the question is whether you're willing to accept the responsibility of being pioneers in a new approach to colonization." Venn said, "We already are pioneers, and all of us human and Keplerian alike." The experimental cooperation spread slowly but steadily over the following months, and Helen Porter's trial period with the Keplerian herder and a patient individual named Vex proved even more successful than Jacob's arrangement, and Vex taught Helen's ranch hands how to predict weather patterns by observing insect behavior, and identified 3 previously unknown water sources on her property, and within 6 weeks, Helen's operation was running smoother than it had in years, and Luis Martinez jumped in with characteristic enthusiasm, and his small ranch became a hub of cultural exchange. Young Keplerians would visit to learn about human technology, while Luis absorbed everything he could about native ecology. And his enthusiasm was infectious, and soon he was documenting everything, and creating what he called a bridge manual between human and Keplerian approaches to land management, and even Charlie Cautious. Charlie had quietly invited a Keplerian scout named Tor to help map his property's water table, and the results had saved him thousands in drilling costs. And Wayne Douglas remained the holdout and watching from his isolated ranch with what seemed like a mixture of disdain and perhaps a bit of envy at his neighbor's success. Then the colonial inspectors arrived, and Jacob was in his north pasture when he got the warning from Charlie's frantic comm call. And Charlie said, "They're here, Jacob, and 3 government vehicles full of inspectors and militia security. And they went to Helen's place first, and now they're heading your way, and you've got maybe 30 minutes," and Jacob's heart sank, and this was it. And the moment they had all feared, and someone must have reported the unusual native activity, probably Wayne, though Jacob couldn't be sure. He immediately calmed Elder Venn and said, "The authorities are coming, and you need to pull your people back and make it look like there's nothing unusual happening here." But Venn's response surprised him and said, "No, we do not hide, and hiding suggests shame and suggests wrongdoing, and we stand with you, Jacob Miller, and let them see what we have built." And Jacob protested, "They'll shut this down, and they might arrest me and charge you with unauthorized contact." And Venn said calmly, "Then let them. Try, and you taught us that sometimes the right path is to stand firm and force others to work around you. And we will do this now." 20 minutes later, 3 official colonial vehicles rolled up to Jacob's ranch, and he stood on his porch and watching them approach with a knot in his stomach, and behind him he could sense rather than see the Keplerian presence, and they hadn't fled to the hills, and instead dozens of them had moved closer, and standing in plain sight in a silent show of solidarity. and the lead inspector was a stern woman named Patricia Lane, and accompanied by 2 militia officers in body armor, and a nervous-looking junior administrator with a data pad. Inspector Lane called out, not bothering with pleasantries, and said, "Jacob Miller, and I'm Inspector Lane and Colonial Administration Office, and we've received reports of unauthorized contact with native populations in violation of Charter Section 7 Article 3, and I'm here to investigate these claims and, if necessary, initiate enforcement proceedings." And Jacob replied evenly, "I'm aware of what the Charter says." And Lane said, "Are you also aware that violations carry penalties ranging from hefty fines to loss of land rights to imprisonment?" And Jacob said, "I am." Inspector Lane frowned and, clearly expecting more protest, and said, "Mr. Miller, I can see native individuals on your property right now, and do you deny that you have been engaging in prohibited contact?" And Jacob said, "I don't deny it, but I would ask you to consider what you're seeing before making any judgments." And Lane said, "The law doesn't require consideration, Mr. Miller, and it requires compliance." And Jacob gestured to the peaceful scene around them and said, "Does it?" He continued, "Inspector Lane, I've been ranching on this planet for 8 years, and for most of that time I followed the Charter to the letter, and I avoided the natives and treated them as wildlife to be managed and ignored their presence as much as possible. And you know what that got me? And a barely sustainable operation with frequent losses to predators and water shortages every dry season, and increasing hostility from native populations being pushed into ever smaller territories. And Lane started to say, "Your business struggles don't justify," but Jacob interrupted with a boldness that surprised himself and said, "I'm not finished. 3 months ago, I made a choice to help someone who was dying regardless of their species, and that choice led to a conversation, which led to cooperation, which has led to the most productive and peaceful period my ranch has ever known. And my cattle are healthier, and my water usage is down, and my understanding of this planet has increased exponentially. And I've built a relationship with the indigenous people that benefits both our communities." And Inspector Lane exchanged glances with the militia officers and said, "Mr. Miller, the Charter exists for good reasons, and unchecked contact with native populations has led to disasters on other colony worlds, and disease transmission, and cultural contamination, and violent conflicts." Cale's voice interrupted and said, all of which stemmed from humans refusing to treat aliens as equals. And they had approached quietly, and their translator device clearly rendering their words for the inspectors, and Cale said, "Your Charter assumes we are problems to be managed, not people to be respected, and this assumption creates the conflicts you fear." And one of the militia officers moved his hand to his weapon and said, "Step back, native." And Cale said simply, "No." The tension ratcheted up immediately, and Inspector Lane looked genuinely worried now, and probably calculating how a violent incident would look in her report. And Jacob said loudly, "Everyone stay calm, and Inspector, these people are not threatening you, and they're simply standing their ground, which is exactly what your Charter tells humans to do when we think we're right." And Lane said, "It's not the same." And Jacob challenged, "Why not?" And because they're alien, and because they don't look like us, and this planet was theirs long before we arrived, and they have societies and families and traditions and knowledge, and they've earned the right to have their voices heard in decisions about their own world. Lane said, "That's not for you to decide, Mr. Miller," and Luis Martinez's voice called out then, "Who decides?" And Jacob turned to see his young neighbor approaching, and followed by Charlie and Helen. And Luis said, "Who decided that we could just show up on this planet and declare it ours?" And Helen Porter added her voice and her usual gruff tone, brooking no argument, and said, "Inspector, I'm the largest ranching operation in this sector, and my productivity is up 22% since I started working with the natives, and that's profit that benefits the entire colony through taxes and resource availability. And you shut this down, and you're hurting the very people you're supposed to be protecting." Inspector Lane looked overwhelmed by the growing crowd of both humans and Keplerians, and her junior administrator was frantically typing on his data pad and probably trying to find a regulation that covered this exact scenario. And she said finally, "This is highly irregular, and the Charter is clear." And Wayne Douglas's voice said, "The Charter is wrong." And everyone turned to see Wayne approaching from the direction of his truck, and Jacob's jaw nearly dropped. And Wayne, of all people, coming to their defense. Wayne fixed the inspector with a hard stare and said, "I didn't want to believe what my neighbors were doing and thought they'd lost their minds, but I've been watching and I've been thinking, and I've come to a conclusion." and any law that prevents mutually beneficial cooperation between intelligent species is a bad law that needs changing. And Lane started to say, Mr. Douglas, the colonial administration. But Wayne interrupted, doesn't live out here, and you folks sit in your climate-controlled offices in the Capitol and make rules about situations you've never personally experienced, and, well, I've experienced it. And I've seen what happens when humans and Keplerians try to share this planet with hostility and suspicion. And I've now seen what happens when they try to share it with cooperation and respect. And the second way works better.